Thanks. So we're glad to have Dixie back. And hopefully Laura will be back with us soon.
Yeah, Laura, I
Um,
know is in Guatemala, and so she's traveling around with a group. I don't know where my daughters are. I know Adrian flew back last night to be back home, and and Marcy, I don't know where she is today.
yeah,
She
and
she
I
told
don't
me,
know where.
yeah, she told me that she knew about the class, so I don't know if there's something that came up. So,
Yeah, same with my daughter. I should perhaps. Oh,
yeah,
Susie just said finishing up the meeting, and I'll be there soon. So it's the nature of having a lunchtime meeting. We just go with the flow, and there's always the recordings. So if you want to catch up, you can.
yeah, they've been keeping up with that.
Perfect. So, oh, I should also say that Kat, who was here for the first 3 or 4 sessions, now has a client. She works for herself who could only make this time. So she's going to keep following on recordings. And then if her client cancels any week, she'll come back in. But she's just kind of following with the recordings at this point. Okay, so lesson number 6. This is the last of the first of the 7 stories. So we completed that initial introductory cycle, and then now we're in the first story, which is from oppression to justice. And as I mentioned before, the first 2 lessons of each cycle focus on the Old Testament and the tradition that Jesus pulls from. And then the third story is how Jesus uses that material and that teaching
No,
and makes it makes
mine
it
can.
his own. Hi, Adrian. Good that you're joining us. So last week, we read about how the Exodus was the foundational experience for the Hebrews, the Jewish people. And in each of these 7 stories, we have what we call a semiotic shift, which is a sort of wordy phrase, but it just means something completely new enters into human history. And so, in what's completely new this time is that God is revealed as a God of justice who who hears the cry of the poor. Um, that's different from the impersonal pantheon of the gods or the gods of the mountain or the river, in which where the human beings were just pawns in their game. So this is the new thing that God is understood to be relational, caring about his people for the first time. So that was a semiotic shift. And then the class before that, when we talked about the Habiru or the Hapiru, um, we did that because we wanted to show that what formed the people right at the very beginning of the biblical story is not bloodlines. It's not that they all belong to the same clan or tribe. Rather, it was this actual experience of liberation that brought them together and formed them as a people. Um, and because they had been aliens in a foreign land, they understood. God says you understand the heart of an alien, of being an outsider. And so the law that is given to them by Moses codifies this. And of course, we know especially the Ten Commandments. That's the bit that everybody knows of the law. Um, and so today, what we're doing is we're going to look at Jesus's reinterpretation of the Ten Commandments, and it's the Sermon on the Mount. Um, but before that, we're going to actually look at the original giving of the law, giving of the Ten Commandments to Moses on Sinai, um, because we have to know what the mm, the original story to know how Jesus changes it or how Jesus reinterprets it. So we're going to start. We're going to do a fair amount of reading from the Bible today because there's a lot of Exodus and Matthew. But we're going to start by reading Exodus 19, 3 to 6. And before we read it, I just want to ask these questions so that you have them in the back of your mind, because I'm going to ask you the questions afterwards. What is the setting and what is the tone? What is the dynamic between God and his people? What do you think the purpose of the Ten Commandments is? And how are the Ten Commandments presented? What is their structure? What are the words that are used? And well, we'll just go with that. So those are sorts of questions. I'll repeat them afterwards. But what's the tone? What's the dynamic between God and his people? What's the purpose of the Ten Commandments? And how are they phrased? Okay. So we're going to start with Exodus 19, verses 3 to 6, and then 10 to 13. I'll just read these for the moment, and then I'll ask people to take over when we get into Matthew, all right? So Exodus chapter 19, verses 3 to 6. Then Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the Israelites, You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine. But you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites. And then 10 to 13. When Moses the Lord said to Moses, Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and prepare for the third day, because on the third day the Lord will come down upon Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. You shall set limits for the people all around, saying, Be careful not to go up the mountain or to touch the edge of it. Any who touch the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch them, but they shall be stoned or shot with arrows. Whether animal or human being, they shall not live. When the trumpet sounds a long blast, they may go up onto the mountain. And then I'm going to skip forward to verse 16. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning, as well as a thick cloud on the mountain, and a blast of a trumpet so loud that all the people who were in the camp trembled. Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God. They took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended upon it in fire. The smoke went up like the smoke of a kiln, while the whole mountain shook violently. As the blast of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses would speak and God would answer him in thunder. When the Lord descended upon Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, the Lord summoned Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. Then the Lord said to Moses, Go down and warn the people not to break through to the Lord to look, otherwise many of them will perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them. Moses said to the Lord, The people are not permitted to come up to Mount Sinai, for you yourself warned us, saying, Set limits around the mountain and keep it holy. The Lord said to him, Go down and come up bringing Aaron with you, but do not let either the priests or the people break through to come up to the Lord, otherwise he will break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and told them. And I'm going to just read now from chapter 20. This is the giving of the Ten Commandments, and that'll be the end of the passages from Exodus. I'm going to read 21 through 21, unless somebody else feels they want to read. Oh, okay, I will go for it. Then spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and the fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the thousandth generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in the 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land, and the Lord your God is giving you, that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. Shall not covet your neighbor's wife or male or female slave or ox or donkey or anything that belongs to your neighbor. When all the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, they were afraid and trembled and stood at a distance and said to Moses, You speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us or we will die. Moses said to the people, Do not be afraid, for God has come only to test you and to put the fear of him upon you so that you do not sin. Then the people stood at a distance while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. Okay, so that's the giving of the Ten Commandments. So I'm going to ask those questions again. What's the setting and what's the tone? What's the dynamic between God and his people there?
I think the drama of it is trying to impress upon everybody how important these Ten Commandments are. You know,
Yeah, it's
that,
pretty
yeah,
dramatic. And God is pretty, I would say fearful, scary, actually, scary God.
Yeah.
You can't even go near him. The people don't even want to hear him because they'll die, you know, see the face of God and die kind of thing. It's very ominous and a lot of dramatic effect. I mean, it's very Charlton Heston, you know. Um, and so, what do you think the having read about the Exodus and what we said earlier about that they had been liberated as slaves? What do you think the purpose of the Ten Commandments is or are?
Well, they just got they just were freed from slavery. Um and they're starting a community, a society solo without a government or rules that were, given to them. So maybe it's about setting the baseline.
Yeah, yeah, and very much the 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 laws are to sort of to control, like you say, Susie. I mean, it's like the same deal that we have today. You know, you're trying to keep order basically, and to have that justice that they'd experience, that the sense that everybody has rights. You know, I mean, it's not the modern idea of human rights as we know it, but that everybody falls under God's judgment, that nobody is excluded, that there is a sort of an equality there. Um,
Yeah,
And basically, yeah, go ahead.
you know, if you don't have some kind of social order, you're just going to have chaos. So
Chaos, correct. Yeah.
yeah, we need some kind of social order put into place here.
Right. And I mean, as slaves, they would have had that. It was basically do what you're told or die. That was basically the rule they had. But this is they're being treated as human beings for the first time. And so they're trying to work it out. And I feel like, as we talked about yet last week, that Moses was this amazing person and enlightened Egyptian who had this call to create this community and to lead this group of rabble out and to form them into this new thing under God, under a God of justice. But the verbal mechanisms or the phrases that are used are what's the phrases that are used with these Ten Commandments?
Well,
What's
it's
the big
thou
one?
shalt,
Thou
most part.
shalt not, right? Thou
Yeah,
shalt not. Yeah, or thou, yeah.
yeah.
So those are those, well, what does it mean when you say thou shalt not? What does that, how does that make you feel? Or what's the uh hidden agenda there? What does it imply? If you say thou shalt not, what does that imply?
If you
Well,
do it, then you'll get in trouble.
Right. So they're prohibitions, right? They're
yeah,
prohibitions with sanctions or punishment attached. And I think that whole scene setting that you described, Maggie, that take this seriously, it's all set to make you take this very seriously. That violent, extra holy, ominous vision of God is loaded into those prohibitions. That's a sanction. So if you break those, that's what's going to fall on you. Basically, it's all that stuff. That's the power of the holy, the dreadful holy. So I want you to keep those Ten Commandments, that narrative in the back of your mind, and we're going to turn now to the Sermon on the Mount, right? This is Jesus's version. And there's in Matthew's Gospel, there are five major discourses, teaching discourses. They're big wadges of education, teaching that Jesus gives. And they're just strung together in big, like 2 or 3 chapters that go. And they're interspersed in the narrative of his story, the story of the gospel, his life and work and healings and his passion narrative, right? So interspersed, you get these big five teaching blocks. And the first and the most well known is called the Sermon on the Mount. The others, in case you're interested, are, let me see, writing down. The second one is a discourse on Christian church, his disciples' mission and the authority of the disciples and martyrdom. The second one is on parables. It's a whole bunch of parables strung together. The third one is a discourse on the church and how they are to be as a Christian community. And the fifth one is a discourse on the end times, where he's teaching about the end times. But the one we're talking about today is Sermon on the Mount. And it's split up into 7 sections. Starts with the Beatitudes. And in your book, Seven Stories, it outlines what the 7 sections are. But basically, there's the Beatitudes. There's a section on how we're called to be the salt of the earth, the light of the world. Then there's a section called the antitheses, and we're going to look at those today. We're basically going to focus on the Beatitudes and the antitheses, right? So Beatitudes, then this little section on salt of the earth, light of the world, then the antitheses. And it's called antitheses because it's, you have heard it said, but I am saying to you. So it's like, that's what antitheses means. That's why they're called the antitheses. Then there's a little section on the 3 major works of piety, which is alms, prayer, alms, and fasting, which was the three major works of piety in the Middle East, or at that time in the East, in that part of the world. Then there's a section on wealth and the purity of heart and seeking the kingdom. Then there's a section on not judging other people. Then there's a section on prayer, trusting in prayer and not in false prophets. And then a final section on true discipleship. So that's the Sermon on the Mount, the 7 sections. But as I said, we're going to focus on the Beatitudes and on the antitheses. There's one other thing I wanted to tell you, is that there's a parallel version in Luke's Gospel called the Sermon on the Plain. And we are going to look at that, at both of them. But mostly we're looking at Matthew because that's the most famous one. So we'll start with the Beatitudes. And well, before we even begin, Sermon on the Mount. So why do you think Jesus went up onto a mountain to give this teaching on the Ten Commandments?
It was where Moses went to the mountain for the
Right.
yeah.
Yes, exactly. So it's not by accident that it's called the Sermon on the Mount. It's Jesus cluing everybody in that he is assuming the role of Moses here. He is the new Moses. So just to have that in your mind. So we're going to look at Matthew's Gospel. Matthew's the first of the Gospels. It's not that it was written first. Mark was probably written first. But Matthew is put first because it's often called the Gospel of the Church. And in the early church, when this was all being put together, because it's got a lot of teaching on how to be a good disciple, there's a lot of emphasis on church and how to be good disciples in this, with all those teaching discourses. It's often called the teaching of the Gospel of the Church, and is often placed first for that reason. Well, it was placed first for that reason. It's not often, it always is placed first. Now each of the Gospels has its own strength, and Mark's Gospel, which was the first, has gained more prominence because it's more, it's the first one. It's very earthy and it just has a lot of power. When you read Mark's Gospel, I'm going off at a tangent here, but when you read Mark's Gospel, it's not as put together as Matthew and Luke. It's more, and Jesus said this, and then he said this, and then he did this, and then he went there, and then he did this. It's very kind of, it's just da 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 da. It's very more primitive in its style, but it's got its own power because of it. It's closer to the time of Jesus. But anyway, that's going off a complete tangent. We're going to go to Matthew 5. And the Sermon on the Mount runs from 5 to 7. It's all of chapter 5 through to all of chapter 7, and that's when it ends. So the Beatitudes are called the Beatitudes because beatific, beatitude means blessed. So, and it's because each of these starts with the phrase blessed are. So that's why they're called Beatitudes. So this time I'm going to have somebody else speak, just so that you're not having me doing a monologue.
I'll start.
Okay, if you want to read 5, 1 through 6. Actually, 5, 1 through 11.
Okay.
What was the what is it, Matthew 5?
Matthew chapter 5, 1 through 11. And then we're gonna, after that, have somebody else read from Luke, and Luke will be Luke 6. Luke chapter 6. All right?
Yep.
Okay.
When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the mercy, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
Right. And then if you just keep your finger in that place and then skip over to Luke chapter 6, verses 20 to 26. If someone else wants to read that one, maybe?
I can read it.
Okay, Susie, go for it.
20 to 26.
Uh-huh.
I don't have the same version of the Bible as
It
you.
really doesn't matter. Go for it. Go on. It's okay.
Looking at his disciples, he said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you and insult you and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man. Rejoice in the day and leap for joy, because great is your reward in heaven. For that is how their ancestors treated the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when everyone speaks well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets."
So most people feel that this version is the original, more original than Matthew's version. Uh, can you, can you see any what are the major differences? First of all, well, what differences can you see between the two versions?
It seems like Matthew's is more poetic and more beautiful than
Yeah.
Luke's. Luke's is kind of cut and dry.
Yeah, it is. And anything else that anyone?
I think it's definitely less scary
Mhm.
than the Ten
Yeah.
Commandments. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Both of them are less scary. The Luke version does have, it has only 4 blessings, 4 beatitudes, and then 4 woes, right? So Matthew doesn't have woes, and he has actually 9 beatitudes, and the last one is doubled up to make 10. So and then the difference that is that Luke, instead of saying poor in spirit and hungry for righteousness, he just says poor and hungry. It's much more earthy and more physical. It's the actual situations of the poor and the hungry. Whereas Matthew expands it to the poor in spirit and those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. So it makes it more spiritual and takes it sort of to a deeper level, and it kind of expands it to include everybody. They both have the same spirit though, and Matthew's version is consistent with Luke's version. They have the same spirit, like the same. So there's not they don't feel like they're discordant. They feel like they complement each other. Well, first of all, we talked about the setting. Well, the 2 settings are that Matthew is up on the mountain because the author really wants to stress he's the new Moses, whereas Luke is actually speaking to them on a plain. I'm not sure whether that has any significance, but it's noted in the text. But the audience, and Adrian had mentioned about or Marcy, I can't remember who it was now, had mentioned about the tone is much less scary than the Ten Commandments and Mount Sinai. What other reasons makes it less scary? I mean, why is it less scary, I should say?
I just think the way that it starts out, like how it, like, you shall not do that, and versus like, oh, you'll be blessed if you,
Right, right. So there's no prohibitions, there's no sanctions
yeah.
here. I mean, there is in Luke's gospel, there's the woe to you because if you're rich now, you're having your reward already.
And
But it's not that God is going to smite you. It's more that it's more descriptive about you're getting your reward. So that's not blessed. That's you.
yeah,
That sucks for you. But it's more describing the situation. It's
yeah.
not something that's going to zap you from on high. It's more describing the
Mhm.
actual circumstances of your choices or the
And
results of your choices.
so I practice trademark law as part of my law practice, and um, courts and the trademark office recognize that um, with a word mark, that it's the first word that is the most impactful and that consumers are most likely to
Hmm.
recognize. Um, so anyway, so when we're trying to get a mark registered, a lot of times we'll get it rejected because it has the same first word as another mark, even though the rest of the word is completely different.
It's
Because
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, because that's what people tend to remember is that first word or first little bit.
So blessed is a good word
Yeah,
to lead
and
with. Yes, exactly. Um, so
I think the Jesus version too is the first word thing just really hit home because it feels like the Beatitudes, you're promoted in a way to be blessed by God and have more relationship, whereas the shall not one is like God's up here and you're below God.
mhm, correct. Maybe that's why Luke said, had his sermon on the plane, that we're all in this together and we're on this journey together. I don't know. But yes, there's none of that dread of the holy, here. It's just a sit down and listen to me tell you how you can be blessed. Come on and get your blessing, kind of, as Heather would say. She's one of our local community members. So the the phrase "blessed are you" is a wisdom motif, and it means fullness of life. You will have fullness of life if you are like this or if you do this. And the first of the Beatitudes are directed towards different classes of people, the poor or the poor in heart, the poor in spirit, the grieving, the meek, which means those who do not use violence. Like we think of meek, we think of things, like a lamb or a dove. Meek is someone who's gentle and who does not use violence. And then the hungry. And then the next four are to do with what's going on inside your heart, is merciful, pure in heart, peacemakers, and the persecuted, because of the sake of the gospel, basically. And but all of them are non-competitive, and all of them are non-violent. They're all activities or states that are non-violent. And I heard somebody recently say how the Beatitudes build on each other, that it's not like you move from one to another, but um, the hardest are the ones at the end where it's talking about the persecution. And as you move through them, it takes more spiritual discipline and strength. I think that that's sort of a little bit not hard and fast, but I can see in a way how that does work. That the initial blessings are more to do with situations and where you find yourself, but the others depend more on making a decision to change your heart or to transform your heart. So, and I mentioned that there's 9, but actually the last one has a rejoice and be glad, which is like an extra blessing. And the last 3, which are blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, and then blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil falsely on you. They're kind of saying the same thing. And then you get the rejoice and be glad. Your reward is in heaven because they persecuted the prophets before you. It's like almost like an echo. So that's how Matthew makes up the 10, the 10 commandments in a way. And the reason why there's so much emphasis on persecution was, of course, at that time, the Christians were being persecuted at the time their gospels were written. And so it was really to give strength and to the community at that time. And as I said, Matthew's gospel is the gospel of the church, the early church. And so it's really a teaching directed to that community.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think there's anything with the number 10 here? Like I know sometimes different numbers will symbolize certain meanings. Is there anything that?
Well, I think there are certain numbers in the Bible that are used and meant to make you think of God's work. So there's the 12 disciples, obviously, and the 12 tribes of Israel.
Yeah.
And then the 10 Beatitudes are meant to make you think, oh, makes me think of the 10 Commandments. And, there's the seventh day and the 7 days of creation. And there's 3 as a biblical number too. So, and often you'll see, and when we look at some of the stories, like in Daniel and other places, we'll see how 7 is particularly considered a holy kind of number. It represents fullness because it's a fullness of creation. And when Jesus heals on the Sabbath day, it's like he's bringing creation to completion. That God worked for the 6 days of creation and then rested on the 7th day, but Jesus works on the 7th day to complete the story, and there's those sorts of things. So if you see numbers in the New Testament, it's always they're always like little cues for you to think of, well, what's this pointing me to? What's this trying to remember? What's this trying to link this to in the Jewish tradition and history, 10, I don't know. I mean, 10, humanly speaking, we have 10 fingers, 10 toes. 10 just seems to be an easy. I think in terms of the Beatitudes, it's meant to remind us about the 10 Commandments, but I think that there's 10 Commandments because you can number them on your fingers, and that's how I just feel like that's probably why Moses came up with 10. I don't know.
Yeah,
it's conjecture.
That's specific symbolism with the number 10, if it meant completeness or something like that. So
I think it's a very human kind of number to use, and I think I don't know.
Okay.
So we're actually gonna look at the
go on. You're on that.
Okay. So we're going to look at the antitheses, which are the statements that begin with "You have heard that it was said," and then follow with "But I say to you." So that's the antitheses. And these relate directly to the 10 Commandments. So it's not just changing over "thou shalt nots" to "blesseds." This is related definitely to reinterpreting the 10 Commandments. So, as we said before, the 10 Commandments were, you shall have no other gods apart from me. You shall not make idols. You shall not take the Lord's name in vain, and you shall observe the Sabbath. Those are the first four, and they're directly related to our relationship with God. So they're all God-centered. And then the final six are to do with our relationships with other people. And it's those ones that Jesus reinterprets. These are number 5, you shall honor your father and mother. Number 6, you shall not murder. Number 7, you shall not commit adultery. Number 8, you shall not steal. Number 9, you shall not bear false witness. And number 10, you shall not covet. All right. Having said that, there's 2 changes that Jesus makes, and we're going to talk about that at the end. One is that he does not refer to number 5, which is you shall honor your father and mother. We're going to talk about why he didn't do that. He doesn't reinterpret that one. He just leaves that one out. And he doubles up on the you shall not commit adultery, and he adds in you shall not divorce. We're going to talk about that too. And again, I want you to I want to preface that by just saying, don't think in terms of 21st century culture here. We're talking about Jesus's time and culture when we talk about divorce. Because we're not going to be bashing people who are divorcees or anything. We're going to look at why Jesus said that in the context of his time. Okay? But let's just read them, actually. Let's read them. But they're kind of long to read all of them. I guess we could read them. This is Matthew 5 again, and we're going to read 21 through to the end of the chapter. All right, so it's quite a long piece. I'll start it and someone else pick it up. We're basically reading half of chapter 5 here. These are the antitheses. Starting at chapter 21, chapter 5, verse 21. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you'll be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gifts there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Somebody else wants to finish through to the end of the chapter?
I'll give it a go. If I lose my voice, somebody else can take over.
Okay.
Again, you have heard that it is said to those of ancient times, you shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. and do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. You have heard it, that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anybody strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, give him your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to the one who asks of you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You have heard it that was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect.
Thank you, Maggie. So first of all, the language Jesus uses is kind of dramatic language. So when the first of the antitheses concerning anger, when he says, the ancient time says you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you're even angry with your brother or sister, you'll be liable to judgment. And if you insult your brother, you'll be liable to the council. And if you say you fool, you'll be liable to the hell of fire. So it's a sort of if you're angry, it's up here. You're going to be more. Your judgment's going to be as much as the Ten Commandments say. That the same as if you murder someone, you're still going to be judged. And then even if you're not even angry, even if you just insult someone, you're not angry with you just give them an insult. It's going to be worse. The punishment seems like it's going to be worse. You're going to be brought before the council. And then if you even just say you're a fool, which is not even really insulting someone in big time, you're going to be thrown into hellfire. It's like the lesser the action, the worse the punishment. It doesn't make sense what Jesus just said there. Rationally, it doesn't make sense. And it's all very it's in order to kind of shock us out of the way that we would normally think about things, that we're used to saying, well, if you do this, then this is going to be the consequence. We're very retributive, like you do this, and it's to do with transactional. We're used to thinking of things in transactional ways, but his rhetoric is not transactional in a logical way. It's to try to kind of, and Jesus does this a lot, is to try to force you out of your comfort zone so you can begin to see things in a different way. And all of these antitheses they're what I wrote here on my notes here, just to get me back into the zone here, is that they free us from the mechanism of prohibition and retribution, but they set a new standard, which is consequential and relational. So he's talking about a transformation of the human heart, which is and it radically changes the way we interact with others. So we're not doing something right because of the prohibition and the sanction and the threat of violence against us. we're doing something right because our heart is leading us into a different relationship with other people. And the result of that is that we find ourselves in a place of blessing that we can experience. We experience the blessing of that. And it also is nonviolent because it breaks, if you do that, it will break the cycle of violence, you know.
I have a
So
question.
yeah, go ahead.
It feels like a roundabout way of getting to that logic. Like sometimes I wonder, like, why didn't he just say that?
Yeah,
It
yeah,
seems like
yeah,
it
yeah. And he does
feels
that a lot. Yeah, you find that a lot in the Gospels. Why didn't Jesus just come out and say that? But you know, the good thing about the way Jesus does things is that it stands the test of time. Sometimes if you say things, you have to do this, this, and this. For one thing, if you want to change somebody's heart, if you start writing down like a list of what they need to do that, you're not actually going to touch their heart. You're just changing one form of law for another, even though it's nicer. You know, so you have to try to jolt people and get people to think in a different way, in order to change them deep in their heart. But also, I feel like Jesus is saying it's because they're not so practical and codified, kind of like that. They stand the test of time better in a way because they're more kind of floating out there and more abstract. That they kind of actually stand up for the modern reader as much as for the people of his time, I think. So I don't know why he spoke like that and why he didn't just say, you got to do it this way. I think it is to do with the fact that he's trying to transform the heart, and that's relational. It's an invitation. It's an invitation, not laying something on you. Um, but I just wanted to talk about the two that, well, first of all, just linking them to the Ten Commandments, those commandments of number 5 through 10 that relate to how we deal with each other. Obviously, the you shall not murder links to the you do not even be angry. Um, you shall not commit adultery in the Ten Commandments is you shall not even lust. But he adds in you shall not divorce also. Jesus adds that extra one in because at his time, a man could just write on a bit of paper, I divorce you, give it to the wife, and he's divorced. The woman couldn't do it, I don't think, but the man could. And that meant that the woman was without any source of support, income support, or protection. She was left totally vulnerable. So we're not talking about modern divorce where you've got divorce lawyers and you can negotiate who gets what, who gets custody. It was at his time, it was the whim of the guy. If he wanted to go get married to somebody different, he could just discard the old wife, you know. So it was a way to protect the woman, uh, in the way, in the spirit of Exodus, you know, protecting the widow and the orphan. A divorced woman would have been in the same situation as a widow. Um, and often I think the divorced woman would not have had any rights over her children either. The guy would have taken the children. So it's a very different situation, and I think that's why Jesus added that one in. However, having said that, he misses out honor your father and mother. So why do you have any kind of gut feelings about why he would have done that? Why that
well,
was not
from the
important to him?
first class, we talked about how the family structure is sort of baked into managing people and their violence. And so father and mother is the core of any family. So I'm
Right.
assuming that might be part of it.
Yeah, I think you're right. Mary Pat, did you want to say something?
It's just like everyone is your father and mother and brother and
Yeah.
sister. We are
Yes.
all together.
So you're both right, I think. So on the one side, by the time Jesus lived, it was a different situation from when the Ten Commandments were written. When the Ten Commandments were given, the mother and father were elderly and again vulnerable people, and the Ten Commandments is saying you can't discard the elderly just because they're old. You have to care for them. At the time of Jesus, the family and the clan had gained a lot of power, and in their culture, the possessions, identity, security, and belonging were all linked to the family. And so Jesus, throughout the Gospels, is always preaching exactly what Mary Pat said, that what is more important than those things, that the inheritance laws, the power that comes from belonging to a certain family, and that is not as important. In fact, it's not important in the kingdom. What's important is how you are in relationship with all people, and with each other. So that the original purpose of that initial commandment had been lost by the time of Jesus. In fact, the family was pretty powerful, and the matriarchs and the patriarchs had a lot of power, and Jesus was actually teaching, if anything, against buying into that. That you shouldn't be seeking that kind of power. It's a different kind of thing that he was teaching. So I think that's why he doesn't include that commandment, and instead doubles down on the adultery and adds in divorce. So you shall not steal. That one would relate to if anyone wants your coat or your cloak, is to do with breaking mimetic rivalry, that desire and rivalry, desire for retaliation. It's again linking to Gerard's thing. So that's what he's talking about there. Then you shall not bear false witness. Jesus says, do not swear at all. And then the final one, you shall not covet. He says, love your enemy and pray for those who harm you. Because by breaking that, again, it's to do with desire and violence. If you break that cycle, he wants us to break that cycle. I've heard some people switch those to do not steal and do not covet around, linking the Old Testament commandments to the other one instead. And I think you can do both. I mean, it fits either way. Tony chose in 7 Stories to link you shall not covet with love your enemies because of the cycle of desire and violence. But you could also relate that one to you shall not steal, and then link the non-retaliation to, and if someone wants your coat and cloak, to the you shall not covet. Anyway, you can play around with it. Basically, those 6 antitheses relate to those 6 commandments, the 5 commandments there. All right. So just the final piece of this lesson is just to underline that there is a shift from the prohibitive and the retributive to consequential and relational. So where in the Decalogue or the 10 Commandments, disobedience brings retribution or sanction, it's fear-based. It was obviously created in order to protect the community, as I think Susie said, because we need something. If we haven't got that transformed heart, we're going to just cycle back into the Girardian scapegoating and chaotic systems. So we need to have something in the law protects us from that scapegoating, desire, and violence cycle that we get caught up in. But if you transform the human heart, as Jesus teaches us in the Beatitudes and in the Antitheses, and the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, you're set free from that cycle of desire and violence. It drops away, and so you don't need the law in the way we used to. And that's why Jesus says it doesn't replace the law. It's like you outgrow the law in a way. It's like I think Augustine says, if you love, you can do what you will. It's the same kind of mentality here, that Jesus says, I haven't come to replace the law, I've come to fulfill the law. And I think by that he means when you don't need those 10 commandments anymore, you've grown spiritually, your heart is free of violence, then you don't need the law anymore, you know. And he adopts nonviolence, which radically changes how we identify with others. He shows us a new way of being human, a shift away from rules and prohibitions to a transformed human heart. And that if you do that, you experience the blessing. You're close to God, you know. When you live like that, you're already in the kingdom. You're already experiencing the blessing, and you can mirror that to other people. And so when Jesus talks about woe to you, or, you know, if you don't do this, you're going to be, he says, come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're on your way to court, or your accuser is going to hand you over to the judge and judge the guard, and then you'll be put in prison. It's not saying if you don't do this, God is going to kill you or God's going to punish you mightily. He's going to say, if you don't do this, if you don't come to terms with your accuser may hand you over to the judge. And he's saying this is what's probably going to happen to you. He's describing the logical human consequences of what happens if you stay in that system of violence and desire. This is what's going to happen. It's nothing to do with God. It's to do with humans. And this is how it's going to play out. So that's what we mean by consequential rather than retributive, his language. He doesn't talk in terms of punishment. He talks in terms of the negative consequences that will happen if we choose not to change. Any escalation of the violence is what we bring on ourselves. It's nothing to do with God's punishment. So, again, putting yourself back into at Jesus' time, he's incredibly ballsy, you know, to go up on this mountain and claim the authority of Moses. I mean, and he does it clearly. He says, you have heard it was said. Well, who said it? It was Moses, right? But I am saying to you. He's claiming the same authority or higher authority than Moses. And the people around him, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, would have known exactly what he was doing. And he didn't cite arguments or texts or try to argue his corner. He just says, I am telling you. He's using an authoritative voice that says, he's making claims as though he's right next to God. So it was quite something that he did this. And he talks about God as love, compassion, and relationship. And you pick that up in the whole of the Sermon on the Mount. So as we said before, the semiotic shift of the Exodus story is that God is on the side of the poor and the oppressed. And you get that from the Sermon on the Mount. But it was the 10 Commandments and the the Exodus narrative is still interpreted in the old ways of violence and power. And so the only way they could think about God was in terms of fear and dread. It was linked to the divine, and that's what gave God the authority to do this. But Jesus reinterprets God's purpose in the Exodus as seeking to enter into a relationship with us, to transform our hearts and bring us into a life of nonviolence, nonviolent actions that will break the cycle of violence and desire in our interactions with other people. And then the other parts of the Sermon on the Mount, which are listed in 7 stories, but we won't read them this morning, when he talks about you are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world. If you do this, you become a source of positive mimesis to the world. You can start that ripple effect. If you break the cycle of violence and turn it around into a cycle of love and forgiveness, that has a ripple effect. And so the salt of the earth, the yeast, light of the world, these are all images that he's talking to his disciples. You have to be this witness to the world. And, there are other places in the Sermon on the Mount where he talks about a tree is known by their fruit, and you have to build your house on rock, on solid teaching. And this is the teaching that I'm giving you. And so through nonviolence, blessing and meaning come to our earth. And the disciples are exhorted, Jesus says, be witnesses, be examples of this in the world. So that was me doing a lot of talking again. Does anyone have any comments or reflections? And I can ask this question, right? Sermon on the Mount has often been taught or preached as really, it's not really achievable. It's idealistic. Only the saints can really live, for example, the Beatitudes, or can do everything that Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount. What's your feeling about that? You think that's true? Or do you think it's really just a teaching for the super saintly among us? Or do you feel like Jesus it's for everyone?
I mean, it does pose the question about like from the second class where or the first class where we talked about the relationship being ongoing versus you having to be perfect right off the bat.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you, Susie. I think it's a process. I don't think anyone is able to probably be that 100% of the time. I don't think anyone has been able to do that 100% of the time, but we're called to do that. And this is what we're called to do. And then I feel like the community at any one time, if you're living in Christian community, there's always somebody giving an example of everything in the Sermon on the Mount. So as a community, we could achieve that. But also it's a call, and in your life, you're always called to be that. And there's nobody who cannot be called from where I'm sitting, that we're all called to do that, all called to be perfect in that way. I think perfection is not the Greek perfect, where there's no blemish. Perfect is being with God, being in tune with God, or being in relationship with God. If you're that close to God, that's perfection. It's not to do with, being sinless or being pure and holy. I kind of don't like those words.
I think Dixie has her hands up. did you
Well,
have your hand up?
well, I feel like he gives us a guide also to love our fellow man more. Um, when I especially that part of when you say thou fool, if you call your fellow man a fool, you're just provoking him. And right now I feel like with our election and everything that's going on with politics, you've got all that going on at both
Yeah,
sides.
yeah.
We just went on this trip and we had different conversations on our bus where people were one side or another side. And the bottom line is it doesn't matter, but stop the
Yeah.
conflict. It hurts people's feelings. And so we need to learn to love one another and let those kinds of things go. It doesn't really matter in the long run.
Right.
So
Yeah. Whoever wins the
look,
government always gets in, right? Yeah.
yeah, he just wants us to love one another, to stop the violence, stop the conflict, and just have better hearts, like he said.
Yeah.
So,
And I think transformation is always one-on-one. I mean, if anyone tells you what to do, there's almost an instinctive recoil against doing it. But I think mirroring goodness is it's inviting, it's attractive, and people want to. And I mean, you can have people in prison or people who are ill, significantly ill. One can be blessed and one can be not blessed. And it's not to do with they can have exactly the same illness, exactly the same prison sentence, but one can be in a place of blessing and one cannot. And it's to do with what's going on inside them, in their spirit and inside their heart, is what creates the prison, what creates the boundary.
I feel like you might
Um,
have said this in so many words, but I mean, thinking about a lot of the journeys that are described in here, really the only person who can, like, if for Moses's um commandments and even Luke's uh beatitudes, there was this element of like there's external folks that can manage you and monitor you. A lot of this feels like if you think about the adultery one, only you, like first of all, it's like committing adultery, people know. It's gonna find people. But he's saying what's in your heart with like if you have a lustful eye, the only people who know about that lustful eye will be you and Jesus. Um, so like that does speak to like this internal relationship because only the two of you know about it. So
mm,
only the two of you need to kind of grapple with it and how you manage your feelings and your experiences inside of you really is
yeah.
how you're managing your relationship with Jesus.
And that's a great example because if you have lust for someone or you covet someone else or something, it you you're not in that place of blessing where you experience a freedom and life is good. Like being a human being feels good. If you have a desire that is basically violence, all of these antitheses are talking about violence that people do to each other. Like Dixie's example of calling someone a fool. It's because it's verbal violence. And swearing, any all of these examples are to do with violence. And if you want someone, you're lusting after someone, it's just is there's a violence in that. It's not loving someone. I mean, nobody can control love, but you can control lust. Lust has violence linked to it. So when he says cut off your hand or cut out your eye, it's just dramatic language for saying let that go. Let that you got to not put yourself in a place where you're going to be at risk for that. Do whatever it takes to remove yourself from that situation so that you can experience what it feels like to be fully alive, fully human, fully blessed. you know. He's trying to teach us what we have to do to feel God's presence fully in our hearts, you know, so that we can feel that blessing. And so many people are under the shadow of violence, either towards themselves, you know, that they're accusing themselves, or violence projected outwards to others. So they can't experience feeling good, you know. I mean, I think everybody yearns to feel good, and by that I mean not morally good, but I mean experientially, you just feel at peace and loved and joyful, all the things that the Beatitudes promise you, that you're fullness, you know, you feel fulfilled, you feel um, comforted, all those things that the Beatitudes mention. That's what being close to God feels like. And the way to do it is all these things. So when people say this is unrealistic or it's idealistic, I think they're thinking morally. They're thinking, oh, making it another law. But I think this is more descriptive. You know, Jesus talks descriptively. If you do these things, you're going to feel this way. You know, I want the best for you. I really want this for you. And then some other questions that were in the book that I wrote down here. Do you think that the Christian churches today live more by the Ten Commandments or by the Beatitudes? That's a tough one. Or maybe not. I don't know.
I think it
I think,
depends on what community you're involved in. Because I look at it as Jesus gave us guidelines, you know, where Moses gave us rules. Jesus gives us guidelines for a better, loving way of life. But because we're human and not perfect, we're going to make mistakes. You know, there's no way we're going to be loving all the time. But with following Jesus' way, we'll know when we've made a mistake. And then we can make amends to whatever wrong we might have done. And with the community, it sometimes, depending on the church or community, if they're not willing to follow God's will, I think egos can get involved in some communities of faith. So if long as the community is focused on wanting to do God's will and be a part of love and not violence, that's the kind of community I want to be part of.
yeah, I think, I can't remember where Paul says it, but, you know, he says, when you were a child, you did things as a child. But now you're adults, put away the childish things. And I feel like the Ten Commandments are there, like with a little child. You just have to lay down the law. You don't try to explain it, or you don't try to change their hearts, you know, in that moment. You want to keep them safe. I think the Ten Commandments are what was given to keep the people safe, like a toddler or like a young child. You just put those laws in place as a safety net around them, because they hadn't developed enough to live a life of the Sermon on the Mount. But Paul says you're put aside those childish things now. You know, you should aim for more. You know, what's expected of you, or what I hope for from you, is more. Is to be fully human, like a fully adult human spiritual person. And by that, you will experience that close relationship with God. You're pulled into the Trinity. It's a quadrinity. You know, you get pulled into that relationship, and you are the fourth part of the Trinity. Quadrinity. So, I mean, I know we're running out of time. I'll just read these questions for you to think of during the week. Um, how does the Sermon on the Mount change the way we understand God and God's purpose? Have I ever felt under judgment, which was then overcome by blessing? And what are the grace-filled times in my life, on my journey? What are the times in my life where I've experienced blessing? And grace is like a blessing that is not earned. Grace just means God's love flowing over you, poured down, pressed down, more than you could ever want. No need for rivalry, no need for desire. It just is. That's grace, is the experience of feeling God's blessing on you. So have you ever felt a time of blessing where it wasn't something you did or that you earned or that you did a good thing and you got that in return? It was just you experienced grace. So that's what Jesus is talking about in the Beatitudes and in the Sermon on the Mount. You can find that if you place yourself in God's kingdom, really. He talks about that space, that way of being as being in the kingdom. It's where God's law, which is what a king has. A king has a law. So God's kingdom is where God's law of love is, it's not even a law, it's where God's love reigns, you know. Okay, so that was the end of the first story of the 7 stories. We're a quarter of the way through the course. It feels long at the moment, but when we get to about halfway, the time starts speeding up. I don't know why, but it always seems to. But next week, we're going to start on the second of the stories, and that's from violence to forgiveness. And that's really looking at the whole of Genesis as a unit, you know, just the whole thing. And then how Jesus used those stories and reinterpreted them in a beautiful way, actually.